Thank you. Weren't they fantastic? Wow. And the fact that they truly are brothers, that's pretty amazing. And you all know Randy, he's in our choir here at St. Lance. We're blessed by his voices, and he dragged his brothers here with him, and we really appreciate that. Oh, Dan just said they didn't have to twist his arm too badly, so thanks, Dan. Dan was a classmate of mine, so. All right, so what you're also here for, besides hearing the wonderful Smishik brothers, is Cory Burggraff. Cory and his wife Lindsay have been part of our parish for 3-4 years now, 2.5. It just seems like longer because they have dug right in and have gotten so involved in many, many aspects of our parish. They have been a blessing to us. And I heard Cory speak at the 2nd grade retreat this year, and I was very impressed with his story. And so we asked him if he would come and share it with all of you, and he graciously said yes. So we're very excited to have Cory with us here tonight. And we also thank you for missing part of the Vikings game to be here. I don't see any purple and yellow out here, but whatever. Anyway, so we will bring Cory on right now, and you will be in for a treat. Thank you again.
Good evening. Good evening. Just going to set this up here real quick. So first things first, I understand, as she said, the Vikings game is kicking off in about 45 minutes. So if I'm not done by then, if you all need to check your phones, I won't be offended. If there's highlights, share them. If anything's going on, if all of a sudden somebody just starts cheering, I'll just assume it's either the Vikings or the Holy Spirit. I don't know which one, but I was asked to share the story with you this evening about how we got here. My name is Cory Burggraff. I'm a parishioner here at St. Lance. As a matter of fact, our family is my wife, Lindsay, and 2 of our 3 children. We attend St. Lance. Our oldest son, he's 19 years old. He's serving in the Marine Corps. He's down in Georgia. Any chance I get to brag about him in front of a group of people, I will do that, so I just did. But I was asked to share the story. We've been here about 2.5 years at St. Lance, and I was just asked to come and talk to you tonight about how we got here. Not just to New Prague, not just to St. Lance, but how we became Catholic. My wife and I were not raised Catholic. We were actually raised a very fundamental Baptist tradition. So it's been kind of an interesting story how we wound up here. And myself, I grew up, we're both from Minnesota. I grew up in Owatonna. I'm sure most of you know what it is, about 45 minutes from here. And like I said, I grew up in a very fundamental Baptist home. We were a typical family. We went to church every Sunday morning, went to church every Sunday night, went to church every Wednesday night, did youth activities. I went to school in the same building. If the pastor was changing the tires on the church van, we were probably sitting there watching him. We were always in church. Anything that was going on, we were there. And my dad actually used to work at a small Baptist college that was in Owatonna at the time. So this was a huge part of our lives, going to church and being brought up like that. And just a little family background. On my mom's side of the family, my parents were actually raised in the Catholic Church. And all the relatives on my mom's side of the family are Catholic. Most of the relatives on my dad's side of the family are Catholic. But about 50 years ago or so, some of my relatives decided they wanted to leave. They wanted to become fundamental Baptist. And that's the limb of the family tree that I came from. So one of the drawbacks with that, it was a great childhood. Like I said, church was always a big part of my life growing up. But one of the drawbacks of having my parents leave the Catholic Church, I was actually kind of raised a little bit anti-Catholic. I was taught all the typical things about the Catholic Church, why it's wrong, and all this and that, and just all the typical things I'm sure some of you have heard. That's what I grew up hearing. And matter of fact, it's kind of a funny story, but where I grew up in Owatonna, I grew up right next to the Catholic school in town. And the best part about that is they had a really, really nice playground. So one of the nicest playgrounds in Owatonna was right out my back door. So one day I was out there playing around, just having fun, and I found this really cool, colorful plastic beaded necklace laying on the ground, which turned out to be a rosary. I had no idea what it was. So I thought it looked cool, so I picked it up and I brought it home, and I was like, oh man, this is awesome. So I showed my mom, I said, hey mom, look what I found out there. And she took it away from me and she scolded me, don't ever bring one of those in our house again. That's what Catholics use. And I was like, I don't know what that thing is, it must be pretty powerful. So, which 40 years later, I feel the same way, but for different reasons. But that's just kind of the way that I grew up. And it kind of made me a little bit sad because I remember as a kid, my grandparents, I was always taught that the church we went to was we were going to be the only ones in heaven. Every other church was wrong, including Catholics. None of my Catholic relatives were going to be in heaven with us. And it always made me really sad because I loved my grandparents, I loved my cousins, I loved my aunts and uncles. And it always just made me really, really sad that they weren't going to be up there with us. And when my grandparents came to visit us, every Sunday morning we would get dressed and we'd go to our church. And they would always walk across the parking lot to the Catholic church. And I always wondered, I was like, well, if they're going to the wrong church, why do they keep going? And the only reason I thought they did when I was growing up is because they always left for church after us, and they were always home before we got home. So I thought maybe that had something to do with it. I didn't really know. But, you know, I just was raised like this my whole life, and you don't really, when you're a young kid, you don't really question it when your parents teach you that, when your teachers at school teach you that, when all of your friends believe the same way. You just kind of take it for granted that that's just what the truth is, and that's just how it is. So I spent my middle school years and high school years just thinking the same thing, going to church all the time because that's what you do. And when I was in high school, I was about to graduate. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And as I put this talk together, you'll find when you go through the story, it's kind of been apparently a theme in my life, because I have a hard time figuring out what I want to be when I grow up. So, an 18-year-old kid, I knew that I probably wasn't going to excel in college. So I knew that if I went there, I'd probably just waste money and do a bunch of stupid things. So I figured, well, I'll join the military. So at least I'll get paid to do stupid things, right? So I decided to join the Navy, and I spent 3 years in the United States Navy. It was a really good experience. I was a ship navigator. They sent me to Celestial Navigation School. That's to navigate with the stars, do all that cool stuff. And I got stationed on a small ship out in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So I went from the cornfields of Owatonna to the beaches of Waikiki in about 4 months. A little bit of a culture shock for a 19-year-old kid, but it was a pretty decent experience. And one of the neat things about being out in Hawaii is at the time, I had an aunt who lived out there. One of my mom's sisters lived in Honolulu. And she lived out there up until that point in my life. She lived there for 20, 25 years, something like that. And so I never really knew her that well. I knew of her, and I met her once or twice, but didn't really know her that well. But my mom told me, she said, well, hey, if you're going to be out in Hawaii, you need to call your aunt and get to know her and spend time with her and everything. So I thought, okay, well, sure, I'll give her a call and you know, meet up with her. And it turned out, and I did, and it turned out to be a great experience. The 3 years that I was out there, we spent a lot of time together. We would go out for dinner together. We'd go to movies. If there was ever a holiday that we were stuck on the island, we'd spend the holidays together. And it worked out really, really nice. And one of the cool things was she lived in a really tall, like a 25-story building in downtown Honolulu. And when you looked out at her apartment, there's all these other buildings, but right across the parking lot was this little tiny one-story church, St. Peter and Paul's Catholic Church, right there in the middle of Honolulu. And she was a faithful parishioner there for years. She sang in the choir, she did all kinds of things at the parish. And every time that I went there, and I was sitting at her apartment on the weekends, never without fail, she would always go to Mass every Saturday night. And didn't matter what we were doing, if we were going to go out for dinner, we'd do that after Mass. If we're doing something, well, we got to be home in time for me to go to Mass. And she always invited me. She invited me every single time. I always said no, because I thought, man, I don't know what would happen if a Baptist kid walked into Catholic church. You know, there's nothing good can come of that. So I always declined and said no. And so, you know, that was another just thing I had growing up. I had this Catholic relative who was always in church and, you know, didn't really think anything of it. And after my 3 years in the military, or in the Navy, after my 3 years, like every other 21-year-old kid, I had my entire life planned out, exactly how it was going to work and exactly what was going to happen. And I knew that the military wasn't going to be a part of it, but I was going to still try to figure out what to do when I got older. And so I moved back to Minnesota. The other thing I knew is that I wanted to get married, start a family, and do all that. So I started started training to be a paramedic, did that for a few years. And I thought to myself at the time, I thought this is going to be a fantastic experience for me. I'm going to move back to Minnesota. I just got out of the military. I'm a veteran. I'm still in pretty decent shape. I'm tan from being on the beaches of Waikiki all the time. I lost my Minnesota accent. I hadn't said you betcha in like 2 years. So I was like, these Minnesota girls are going to fall head over heels for me. And I was so excited. I figured this is going to be a no-brainer trying to get married. Well, I was wrong. I thought way higher of myself than they did, except one. I was able to wear one down and get her through, and she's sitting here now. It's my wife, Lindsay. A lot of you know her. But kind of a funny story how it's long story how we actually got set up together. But it was a mutual friend who came up to me and said, hey, do you know who this Lindsay girl is? I said, yeah, I know who that is. She's beautiful. I'd love to go out with her. He goes, okay, well, so you tried setting this up together. And my first impression of her is she was absolutely beautiful, and I would love to go out with her. And he asked her, he said, hey, you know who this Cory guy is? And she said, yeah. He goes, he's really annoying and talks a lot. I'm not making that up. That was her first impression of me, is I'm annoying and I talk a lot. And I spent the last 23 years trying to change that opinion. You'll have to ask her if I did, I don't know. But Lindsay and I had started dating, and we got married. And like I said, Lindsay was raised very similar to how I was. She was raised in a very strict, fundamental Baptist upbringing, going to church all the time, you know, the same beliefs, same values, same everything that was taught to me and her growing up. And so one of the things that I am thankful for that is, even though we're not in that tradition anymore, I really, really do thank my parents for raising me like that, and for Lindsay's parents raising her like that. Because when we got married, we knew we wanted to raise our family in church. And when we got married, there was just no question that we were just going to find a church and go to church and be involved. And so we did. At the time, we were living in Faribault, Minnesota. I was working as a paramedic. Our oldest son was just born. We were just a young family. We found a good non-denominational church there that we were attending, and got involved. I would play guitar in the praise and worship band on Sunday mornings. Lindsay, of course, was singing in the praise and worship band. We were doing small group Bible studies and just really getting involved. It was a great church, great thing to be involved in. And after I got out of the military for a couple years, I felt this desire to go back in. So I asked Lindsay, I said, well, hey, how do you feel about me going back in the military? And she said, no. I said, okay. So I waited a couple months, waited for some more opportunities. I said, hey, well, this really good opportunity came. You know, all these wars are kicking off. They're looking for people. How do you feel about me joining the military? She said, no. I said, all right, well, this ain't working. So the compromise we had is that I was going to join the Navy Reserve 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. And that would give me my military fix, and, you know, we'd continue living in Minnesota. And the first training exercise I had to do, I had to go to Okinawa, Japan for 2 weeks. So I went out to Japan, just helping out in these war games that they were doing. And I really, it was the first time that I was back surrounded by the military, and I thought, I really want to go back to the military. It's really where I need to be. And I thought to myself, I wonder if the Army still has that program where you can join and be a helicopter pilot, because that's always something. It's still trying to figure out what to do when I grow up. I thought that's always something I wanted to do. So I called a recruiter from Japan. I called a recruiter in Minnesota and told him who I was, told him what I wanted to do. And he said, yeah, when we get back, just come to my office and talk to me. And I thought, okay, cool. So Lindsay picked me up from the airport after I flew home. We were driving back to our house, and I said, Lindsay, I said, I really want to go back in the military. She said, yeah, I figured you would, you know, after being there for a couple of weeks. I said, all right, well, I'm going to join the Army and be a helicopter pilot. And she said, what? And I said, no, I'm serious. I'm going to join the Army and be a helicopter pilot. She said, okay, do it. I said, cool. I got a meeting on Tuesday with the recruiter. So we went to the recruiter's office. We started the whole process. Did all the interviews, did all the physical exams, did all the stuff that had to be involved. I got accepted. And about 6 months later, we packed up the family, threw everything in a U-Haul, got our 1-year-old son, the dog, got everybody packed up, and we moved down to Fort Rucker, Alabama. Southern Alabama, surrounded by cotton fields and peanut fields, about an hour away from the Gulf of Mexico. Again, a pretty big culture shock. But it was a really good experience. Again, I was learning how to fly helicopters. I was new to the Army. I was learning all these things. Lindsay was getting the hang of being an Army wife, and we were just kind of learning this whole new culture. And when we got there, we did what we always do. We found a church, and we started attending. And we just started attending just the regular Protestant church service at Fort Rucker there. It was run by all the Protestant chaplains. They did a great job running the church. And we went there, but at this time in our lives, we went there, and we still felt we still had a really strong faith in God. But at this point, going to church just kind of felt like kind of automatic, I would say. We went to church because that's just what you do on a Sunday morning, is you go to church. Not really, we're reading the Bible and still praying and, doing all that, but just kind of going through the motions and just kind of searching for just something a little deeper. And one day, I was on some task there at Fort Rucker, and I was on this job with a friend of mine, and I knew him from a previous school, and he always walked around in his hip pockets. He always had a New Testament. And anytime we were on break or something going on, he always got his Bible and he was always reading it. So I knew this guy was really faithful Christian, was really passionate about the Bible, was really, very well read and all these things. So we got on the subject. We got on the subject one day of churches and church and what we believe and why we believe. He asked me. He said, "Well, how I was raised." So I explained it to him, and he was telling me what he believed, and we started talking back and forth and got more and more conversations, and actually started studying the Bible together. And come to find out, he went to it's a smaller Protestant denomination called the Churches of Christ. Some of you may be familiar with them. They very good people. They take a very literal interpretation of the Bible, a little bit different beliefs than what we were raised, but really, really kind of appealed to us. There's this really fancy Latin term called sola scriptura, which means the Bible only, and that's the only thing that they use the Bible exactly how it is in the Bible, according to their interpretation of it. And this was a system that I really kind of latched onto. I thought it was really neat. I was learning more and more about the Bible, studying more and more about it. Our beliefs started changing a little bit from how we were raised, but it started to seem a little more personal for us. We started really kind of getting more involved and started reading the Bible, started meaning a lot more to us. And so we started attending the Church of Christ there, got involved. Again, Lindsay started singing. Apparently everywhere we go, Lindsay winds up singing. And so, getting involved, again, doing small group Bible studies and things like that. And one of the things that I have, when I look back on the whole story, this is kind of where the ship slowly started to turn towards Catholicism. I didn't know that at the time. I would have never guessed that at the time. But one of the drawbacks of this mentality, this lens that I was looking at the Bible through now, is I became what I consider, I guess, very spiritually arrogant. And I would look at every other denomination and every other church, and I would look at them according to my interpretation. I'd find everything wrong with them. And I used to get in discussions with my mom about the stuff she taught us growing up in the Baptist church, and I'd tell her where she was wrong and my church was right. And, I'd get home and I'd Google, what do Methodists believe? So I was looking at them like, oh man, they're wrong because of this, this, and this. And the Lutherans, Catholics, I didn't even try because I still knew they weren't even close to being right, so I didn't even consider looking at the Catholic Church. And so this was just kind of the whole interpretation that I had, and just kind of kept this mentality for a few years, which fortunately God used later on to actually bring us to the Catholic Church. But we finished up our time in Fort Rucker. I was about to graduate flight school, and it was time for us to move on to our new first duty station. I was going to go to my first squadron, just a newly minted brand new helicopter pilot in the Army. And at the time, we'd been in Rucker for about 2 years, and we found that we really, really liked warm weather. We really liked it when the coldest temperature you saw on Christmas was 45 degrees. The Gulf of Mexico was right there. We decided we were never going to move back to Minnesota. We're never going to move back anywhere cold if we can help it. We really wanted to stay in the warm temperature. The problem is, at the time, the Army was sending a lot of people to Fort Drum, New York. If you don't know where Fort Drum, New York is, it's upstate New York, right on the lake, very cold, very windy, bitter winters. We wanted nothing to do with it. So we were praying. I was like, God, please do not send me to Fort Drum, New York. I love warm weather. I'll go where the Army sends me, but please, please, God, do not send us to Fort Drum, New York. And he answered our prayers. We didn't go to Fort Drum, New York. Instead, we got orders to Fairbanks, Alaska. So lesson learned, if you pray, be specific. So we got what we asked for. But so we packed up the family. We had 2 kids at the time. We packed up the family, packed up the dog, drove a U-Haul truck all the way from Alabama up to Fairbanks, Alaska. A little bit of a hike, just me and the dog in a U-Haul for about a week and a half. Great experience. But we made it there. We did what we usually do. I got there, got set up, in the unit, started meeting people, and then we did what we typically do. We found a church that appealed to us, that interpreted the Bible according to our interpretation, how we wanted it to be. And so we found this group and started getting involved with this church there. And turned out to be great. Again, I was playing guitar and Lindsay was singing. We were doing small group Bible studies. And they'd actually asked me now to teach a couple Bible classes. So I was teaching Bible classes, adult Bible classes there. And then the pastor actually asked me one time, he said, hey, I need someone to fill in on the weekends. Could you help out? I said, sure. So I preached on Sunday mornings a couple times, and the full sermon was, up there preaching and doing that. So we were very involved in the church and just going on with our lives. And the Army, they always send you, my job was to fly helicopters, but they always have other duties for you to do as well. And so one of the jobs that I had, they had to send me to a school for about 2 weeks. It was up right there in Alaska, but I just had to go sit in a classroom for 2 weeks. And so I was sitting there one day, and there was a guy a couple of seats down from me, and he was reading a book called Great Lent. And I thought, great Lent. I said, I remember that. And it makes sense. This was in February or March. It was during Lent. And I didn't know much about Lent at the time because that wasn't a thing at all in our upbringing. It wasn't even on the radar. The only thing I knew about Lent is that my grandparents did it, my cousins did it, and you just eat less chocolate and more fish. Pretty much the only thing I knew about Lent. So I figured, I said, well, if he's reading a book about Lent, he's probably going to the wrong church, and I should probably fix that for him. So on break, I struck up a conversation with him, and I said, hey, if you don't mind my asking, I said, where do you go to church? And he said, oh, I'm Eastern Orthodox. I said, oh, Eastern Orthodox. I said, okay. And that's something I wasn't really familiar with, so I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. I haven't picked apart that church yet. So I just put it on the list, and I said, well, I go to the Church of Christ, and I said, we worship exactly according to how the first century Christians worship, nothing more, nothing less. And he looked at me, and he said, yeah, so do we. And I thought, well, this way, that can't be right. So I went home, and I Googled what the Eastern Orthodox Church was and what they taught. And they had priests, they had bishops, they had icons, they had sacraments, they had infant baptism, they had this whole list of things that were completely foreign to me. Nothing had anything look like my upbringing, and nothing looked like anything I did in church on Sunday morning. So I was thinking to myself, I thought, well, how can we be making the same claim that we're the right church and that we're doing the right things? How can we both make that claim, but what we're doing on Sunday morning is so drastically different? So I went to class the next day, and I said, hey, I got a question for you. I said, why do you guys have priests? I thought that was an Old Testament thing. And so he explained to me what priests were, same as we have in the Catholic Church. He explained it to me, and I thought, oh, well, that's not something I ever heard before, but it's, he gave me a legitimate answer. So the next day I came back, still in an effort to try and get him to realize he was wrong. I asked him, I said, well, why do you baptize infants? Because that's wrong. You guys shouldn't be baptizing infants. So he gave me a very well thought out argument for infant baptism. I thought, okay, well, I've never heard that before, but it is what it is, he believes that. And so we started talking more and more about churches, and this whole window of just things I never even heard of opened up. And he gave me a couple books to read. He said, well, if you're interested in the Orthodox Church, he said, here's a couple books to read, here's some podcasts. Podcasts were just starting to become a thing. So he sasaid, here's some things to listen to, they might answer your questions. So I said, okay, so I started reading and started learning more and more, and I was learning things like, all like the ecumenical councils. I was learning about those. That was something I never even heard of before. I was learning about church history before the Protestant Reformation, which I didn't even know there was a church history before then. So I was learning about that, and I was really, really just kind of diving in. I thought, oh, this is just a very interesting kind of segue, different than what we learned. And one day he said to me, he goes, Cory, he said, well, if you want, he said, why don't you just come to Divine Liturgy with me sometime? And in the Eastern tradition, that's what they call, we call it Mass, they call it Divine Liturgy. So I thought, okay, well, I don't know what this is all about, but sure, it can't hurt. So I drove out to this very small Orthodox church, out about 5 miles outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. The whole church was about the size of our chapel. It was very, very small. And I walked in, and there were icons all over the wall. It still smelled like incense, because the Eastern tradition, they love their incense. It still smelled like incense. There was a priest up there with these vestments I'd never seen, with this huge gold cross on his chest. There was some guy in the corner chanting the Psalms. There was no musical instruments, there's no seats, you have to stand the whole time. And I thought, this is really strange. And the liturgy went on, with a lot of chanting, a lot of prayers, a lot of things going on. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, I thought, you know what? This is the most un-Protestant thing I've ever seen in my life. But I didn't feel uncomfortable. I thought, I don't know what these people are doing, but what they're doing is very respectful and very reverent. And it just kind of struck me. I thought, maybe there's a little bit more to this Orthodox church than I gave it credit for. And then so I started studying more and more, kept learning more and more, and actually started spending time with the priest, the Orthodox priest. He was answering some questions for me. And slowly just started, it wasn't that a big light bulb went off, as far as, wanting to switch churches right away. It was a very slow thing, but really what happened is all these Protestant beliefs that I had growing up, slowly the foundation just started to fall apart. It just started to crumble, and all these arguments that I had for everything that we were talking growing up, really the arguments just sort of got weaker and weaker. And there was one day I remember I was driving down the road, I was on my way to work, and I was listening to this podcast of this Orthodox convert, and he goes, one question I love to ask my Protestant friends is, what is the pillar and foundation of truth? And so I answered out loud, I said, well, everybody knows it's the Bible. The Bible is the pillar and foundation of truth, because they taught me that since I was in Sunday school when I was 4 years old. The Bible is the pillar and foundation of truth. And he said, you know, according to the Bible, it's not the Bible. It's actually the church is the pillar and foundation of truth. And I thought, well, hold on, that can't be right. So I pulled over to the side of the road, and I opened up my glove compartment, and I got a Bible out, because I thought, I don't know what interpretation of the Bible this guy's reading, but he's obviously wrong. There's no way that the Bible says that. So I got a Bible out of my glove compartment, because like a good Protestant, I had about 11 Bibles laying around. So I got a Bible out, I looked up 1 Timothy 3:15, and it in fact says that the church is the pillar and foundation of truth. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, I thought, you know what, I've read the Bible from cover to cover. I've read the New Testament probably a half a dozen times. How come I never saw this verse before? And it just struck me that I thought, well, if Jesus established a church, and then later on the Bible came, then obviously, you know, what Jesus established, if that's still going on, I was like, there's got to be something here. So I kept studying about it, kept praying about it, and after about a year or so, I said, Lindsay, this is what I'm all learning, this is what I'm studying. I was sharing a lot of this stuff with her, so she was kind of, you know, so she kind of knew what was going on. And I said, Lindsay, I said, I really think we need to join the Orthodox Church. And she said, no. I said, okay. I said, well, why don't you come to liturgy with me sometime? You can see how cool it is, you can see how nice it is, and it'll definitely change your mind. She said, no. I said, all right, well, here's some books to read. You want to read these? I'll answer your questions. I said, you know, anything you have, I can introduce you to the priest. We can get you all straightened out. You know, you can learn all this stuff. And she said, no. She wanted nothing to do with the Orthodox Church. I thought, okay, well, this is going nowhere real fast. So we just kind of continued on, doing our thing, going on with our lives. And, you know, I deployed once to Iraq, came back, you know, we were just continuing our life there. And after about 3 years, in true Army tradition, it was time to move. So we packed up the family again, and we moved down to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, and moved to Fort Campbell. And before we went there, I looked up and wanted to see if there was an Orthodox church there, because I thought I'd got to continue this study, because this has just blown me away. And sure enough, there was. It was a very small Eastern Orthodox church in Clarksville, Tennessee, about 15, 20 minutes away from where we lived. And I thought, well, this is going to be perfect. So we went there, got all settled in, got the family all settled in, and I called the priest at the church, introduced myself, and told him what, you know, my whole story and all these things. And he said, well, yeah, let's meet and, you know, talk about things. So I met and I started talking with him, and in the meantime, we did our normal thing. We found another Protestant church there, got involved with our small group Bible studies, got to know the pastor of the church there really well. Lindsay and the kids were involved, they were doing things, and the whole time I was having a harder and harder time attending a Protestant church. Not because the church was bad or because anything really evil about it, it's just I started learning more and more about ancient Christianity and older churches and things, and it just got harder and harder for me to sit there. And, you know, I was meeting with this priest, and finally we came to this compromise where I told Lindsay, I said, all right, we're going to try and make this work. I said, how about one Sunday a month, I'm going to join the Orthodox Church. One Sunday a month, I'll go there, and the other Sundays, we'll go to the Protestant church. And she said, okay. So one Sunday a month, I went to an Orthodox liturgy, and she still went to the Protestant church. And we kind of made this work for a while, and when I look back on it, I guess it's something I didn't think about at the time, but I'm really thankful that even though Lindsay and I didn't see churches the same way, it was the first time that we didn't agree totally on churches, it never came between us. It never really hurt our marriage, it never hurt our relationship. It was just one of those things that we just didn't really agree on. And so I figured, I thought, well, you know, slowly I can wear her down, and I can, you know, try and get her to see it my way. And so I still, you know, kept studying, still kept learning, and still kept, you know, trying to get closer and closer to getting her to the Orthodox Church, which never happened. And deployed again to Afghanistan, got to see the beautiful part of the world there, came back, and in true Army tradition, again, once you get comfortable and once you get all settled in, it's time to move. So we got orders to Fort Polk, Louisiana. And if you've never been to Fort Polk, Louisiana, I recommend you keep it that way. It's not typical. We actually had a good time there, but there's all these great places to be stationed in the military. That is not one of them. It's a base out in the middle of a bunch of swamps in southern Louisiana. And we got orders there. I thought, okay, well, that's fine. So I looked up if there was an Eastern Orthodox church around there. And it turns out the closest church was about 2.5 hours away. So I said, man, I'm really not going to make this work now. So I talked to the priest friend of mine, and I said, well, I got a question for you. I said, I'm moving somewhere where they don't have an Orthodox church. I said, how would you feel about me attending a Catholic Mass every once in a while? I said, I won't take the Eucharist, I won't, but it's at least liturgical, it's at least sacramental. They have priests, it's definitely a lot closer than going to a Protestant church. I said, how would you feel about me doing that? And he said, well, and he told me something that was really, really interesting. He said, well, you can do that, Cory, but he said, you have to be careful. Because he said, Catholic doctrine will wear on you after a while. And I thought, wow, that's a really weird thing to say. But I thought, well, if Catholic doctrine is going to wear on you after a while, I should probably start seeing what it is these Catholics actually teach and believe. So that way if some priest is, giving a homily and he starts saying something, I'll know when to tune him out or when to listen to him. So I started thinking like, well, I should look into the Catholic Church just for the intent of finding out where they're wrong on everything. So I went to work one day, and I had this friend that I worked with who was a very, very knowledgeable, very devout Catholic. He used to teach the RCIA classes at Fort Campbell, which I think they call OCIA now, it's changed, but he used to teach those classes. He was very involved in the parish. And I asked him one day, I said, Bill, I got a question for you. He said, all right, what's that? I said, why is it that you Catholics, I said, why do you worship the Pope? And why do you believe that he's sinless and you hold him on the same level as Jesus Christ? Because this was something I was taught growing up. And he said, well, we don't believe that at all. I said, well, yeah, you do. And he said, no, we don't. I said, yeah, you do. I said, my mom and dad left the Catholic Church 50 years ago, and that's what they told me you believe. He said, no, we don't believe that. So he explained the Catholic Church's view of the Pope. And I thought, and I remember going home, and I thought, man, it's too bad. Bill doesn't even know what his own church teaches. So I went home, and of course I Googled it, and I found a website called CatholicAnswers.com. Excellent resource, by the way, if you have anything you want to study to learn. Looked up CatholicAnswers.com, and I typed in, the Catholic view of the Pope. And turns out Bill was right. It explained it very well, and I thought, okay, well, Bill got one right. Good for him. So I went to work the next day. I said, Bill, got another Catholic question for you. He goes, what do you got? And Bill was very patient, very, very patient man. I'm very thankful for that. And I said, why is it that you guys worship Mary? So I said, I'm pretty sure we're only supposed to worship Jesus, but you guys worship Mary also. And he goes, we don't worship Mary. I said, yeah, you do. He said, no, we don't. I said, yeah, you do. And he said, no, we don't. And so he explained to me, he said, well, we venerate Mary because we honor her because Jesus did. I thought, okay, poor Bill. So I drove home, looked up again, and sure enough, Bill was right. So I thought, okay, well, maybe this Catholic Church isn't as bad as I was taught to believe. Still have no desire to join it. There's no way Lindsay's going to want anything to do with this. So I thought, well, I'm still going to keep learning and keep studying so that I can, just figure out what I should do. So one of the things that the Army does is when you're an officer, you have to periodically in your career go to professional development schools. And they always time it when you're moving, or a lot of times they time it when you're moving. I always thought they did it for efficiency. I think they do it to punish family members. Because I moved Lindsay and the kids, two of the kids and the dog, moved them all down to Louisiana, put the stuff in the house, and quickly said, goodbye, I'll be back. And I left for 2 months. So let her kind of figure out how to navigate through the swamps of Louisiana and, get used to this new installation. And I had to go back to Alabama for 2 months for school. And while we were there, just kind of to show you sort of the stressful part of this, I was in my barracks room one night. It was about 11 o'clock on a Friday night. And she texted me and said, call me immediately. And I thought, oh man, I hope the dog is okay. And the kids, I was concerned about the kids too. So I thought, okay, well, what's this? So I called her and she said, hey, I just killed a scorpion in the living room. I said, no, you didn't. I said, there's no scorpions in Louisiana. She said, yeah, I did. I said, well, take a picture of it and send it to me. So she takes a picture and sends it to me. And I thought, wow, that's a scorpion. Turns out there's scorpions in Louisiana. They get in your house. They freak your wife out at 11 o'clock on a Friday. And so I called her. I said, hey, that is indeed a scorpion. You're right. Good job. I'll see you in about a month and a half. And that was about as far as it went. So I was at Fort Rucker. And while I was there, I was in Alabama. She was in Louisiana. And while I was in Alabama, just because I knew that I had a lot of friends in the area, I still had a lot of friends at the original Protestant Church of Christ that we went to. That's where I went on Sunday mornings. Because I knew that if they knew I was in town and I wasn't at church, it was going to raise a bunch of questions. So I thought, I'll just go there. It is what it is. It's only 2 months. And so I did that on Sunday mornings. And then one afternoon, I was sitting in my room and I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to a Catholic Mass. It was on a Saturday afternoon. I thought, I'm going to go to a Catholic Mass and see what this is all about. So I went to the Catholic Mass on post at Fort Rucker. There was a Catholic chaplain said Mass. It was a great Mass, just a typical Mass, went through it, and I was done. We were walking out, and in the back of the church there's this table, and it had all this literature on it about the Catholic Church and different things. So I grabbed a couple of them, and they had a bunch of rosaries there. And so I took one. I didn't tell my mom. So I took one of the rosaries home, and we're back to my room. I didn't really know what to do, that I knew Catholics used it. I knew it was some kind of prayer thing. I didn't really know much about it. But I started slowly reading more about the Catholic Church. And more that I read about the Catholic Church, I started to discover that it wasn't as bad as I was raised to believe. And I went to a bookstore. I got a book on Catholicism, started learning a little bit about it. And slowly, this huge wall that I had up my entire life about Catholicism, slowly the wall just started to crumble. And all these things that I was taught growing up about the Catholic Church, I never questioned it. Well, now I was starting to question things and found that I was taught a lot of incorrect things about the Catholic Church. And the funny thing is since we became Catholic, I've actually taught my parents things about the Catholic Church that they didn't know growing up in it. And slowly this wall just started to crumble a little bit. And one day, I saw the rosary laying there, and I thought, I wonder how this works. So I Googled how to pray a rosary. And so I saw the prayers. I thought, okay, well, it's a prayer device, and prayer is prayer. It can't be bad. So I prayed a rosary. And I thought, oh, well, that was neat. Something I can, I guess, put in my spiritual toolbox, I guess. And didn't really see the significance of it then. I just thought it was a really good tool to use. And then, just kind of kept on and just started learning more about the Catholic Church. And started seeing that there was this church that Jesus established, and he did say the gates of hell will not prevail against it, and they can trace themselves all the way up 2,000 years. They do have the Eucharist, this unbroken chain, and I thought, well, maybe there's something here that I was missing. So then I had this weird experience. When I look back on it now, I think it was just the Holy Spirit doing what the Holy Spirit does. I woke up on Sunday morning, and I just had this weird desire that I just didn't want to go to church. I didn't want to go to the Protestant church. I wasn't tired. I didn't have anything going on. I just woke up and just felt, wow, I just really don't want to be there. But I thought, no, I need to go, because if I'm not, I'm going to start getting phone calls. People ask where I am. So I was getting ready, and I was driving. It was about a 20-minute drive to get there. And the whole time I was driving there, I just could not get myself to want to go to church. I just didn't want to do it. But I thought, no, I'm going to do it. So I drove in, and I parked in the parking lot, and I just sat in my truck, and I thought, no, I'm not going to do this. And so I left. I got about a half a mile down the road, and I thought, no, I need to go to church. So I did a U-turn. I went back to the church, parked in the parking lot again, and sat there again, and thought, I really just don't want to be here. So I left again, and I was driving away, and I was sitting at a red light, and I looked over, and across this field, I saw this steeple from a church poking up through these trees, and I thought, well, I wonder what church is over there. So I looked up on my map real quick, and it turns out it was a Catholic church. So I thought, well, I'm just going to go there and see what they have going on today. So I drove in, tons of cars in the parking lot, people walking in, and it turns out Mass started in about 10 minutes. I thought, perfect. I'm going to go to Mass this morning at a Catholic church. And it just felt right. Not really thinking anything of it, not expecting anything interesting to happen. And I went in, Mass started, we were going through the Mass. At this time, I'd gone to the Mass probably 5 or 10 times, so I was starting to get used to the order of it and how it all happened. And I remember to this day, that was about 10 years ago, I remember to this day what the priest did his homily on. And he was preaching on Matthew chapter 14, or he did his homily on Matthew chapter 14, when Jesus got the loaves and fishes, and he multiplied that, and he fed 5,000 people. And so he used this little bit to multiply people, to feed them spiritually, or feed them physically. And then he compared that to the Eucharist, and how Jesus for 2,000 years has been doing that and feeding us spiritually. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks, because I thought, you know what? I've heard this story probably 100 times, ever since I was a little kid in Sunday school class. Everybody's heard this story, but I've never heard it explained that way. And I've never seen a church that puts such an emphasis on the Eucharist and on Jesus Christ and this unbroken chain. And what we're doing now is the same thing that's been going on for so long. And I finally had this little tiny inkling. I thought, man, I wonder if I should be Catholic. And it kind of scared me a little bit, because I thought, man, there's no way I can do this. There's no way that I could be part of this church. And the Mass went on, and I was sitting in the back. I was just sat in the back of the church. And about 3 or 4 rows in front of me, we were all kneeling. The priest was doing the prayers. About 3 or 4 rows in front of me, there was this kid. He was about 5 years old. he gets up, because we all know for whatever reason, I don't know why it is, but when a priest starts talking, all the kids have to go to the bathroom. So this kid was no exception. So he gets up and he walks out and he turns around and faced the front of the church and he did his sign of the cross and he genuflected and walked out. And I saw him and I thought, you know what? I want my kids to do that. I don't know where the thought came from, but I thought, that kid doesn't know everything that's going on in Mass. He probably doesn't know all the theology, all the doctrine. He doesn't know all these things. But he knows enough to know that what's happening here is reverent and respectful enough to Jesus that that's how he did it. He did the sign of the cross and paid respect. And I thought, you know what? I want my kids to do that. But that means I have to be Catholic. And so I left Mass that day and I drove back to my room and I spent the whole afternoon just sitting in my barracks room just kind of thinking about this. And I thought, well, what just happened? I was thinking about all the things that I had learned this whole journey up to this point, and I thought, man, I'm going to have to be Catholic because there's nowhere else to go. And I thought, I don't think I can do this. So I actually prayed and I said, God, if you want my family in this church, I said, if you want us to move here, or if you want us to become Catholic, I'll do it, but you're going to have to work some miracles because you've met my wife. You know how she feels about churches. This ain't going to go well. So when we finished up, I was finishing up my time at Fort Rucker. It was about time to go back to Louisiana. And I came to this decision that the Catholic study, it was a good thing. There's not near as bad as I thought it was as a church, but I can't tell Lindsay anything about this. I'm just going to go back home, I'm just going to chalk it up as a really good academic study. I'm just going to chalk it up as, I learned a couple things, and that's that. So I packed up all my stuff, I drove home. It was about a 10 or 12 hour drive, and I thought, well, I'm not going to show her the rosary, I'm not going to show her any of the books that I was reading, I'm not going to tell her anything that I did in Mass, I'm not going to tell her anything about the Catholic Church. So I got home, and about an hour later, I said, hey, Lindsay, want to hear something really interesting about the Catholic Church? So I kept it to myself for about an hour. And then I told her everything. I told her everything that I had learned that summer. I told her everything that I prayed about. I talked to her about the church, about, even some of the reservations I had in the Orthodox Church and the organization-wise. I said, this church, I said, there's nowhere else to go. I said, the Catholic Church, if we believe that Jesus started this church that he talks about in Matthew chapter 16, if we believe that he started it and it's still going, I said, there's nowhere else to go. And I remember telling her, I said, if I were to remain Protestant or continue going to a Protestant church, I said, I have to believe one of two things. In Matthew 16, when Jesus said, I'll establish this church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, I said, I have to believe one or two things. Either Jesus lied to us, or the gates of hell are stronger than Jesus' words, in which case there's no point in doing any of this anyway. I said the third option is that Jesus did in fact establish a church. It's still here. It's called the Catholic Church. And that's, where we need to be. And I said, so Lindsay, I said, I really think that we should join the Catholic Church. And she said, well, if there's ever a time to do it, now's the time. I said, wait, what? And she said, well, if we're ever going to join the Catholic Church, now's the time to do it. And I said, just hold on. And in all the studying that I've done, all the learning that I've done, all the articles I've read, podcasts, all the priests that I've talked to, I never, ever prepared for my wife to agree with me. Which, not just on this topic, but never thought that she would ever agree to this. And I thought, just wait, if you were to ask Lindsay to this day, why did you say yes to that? She would only say two. It's the Holy Spirit said, she just felt that I was in the right spot, we're in the right spot, and we should join the Catholic Church. I said, okay. And so I told her all the things that I had learned and all the things that I'd studied, and she agreed with me, and I said, okay, well, next Sunday, because what we did whenever we moved somewhere is I always went to church first. I was a scout reconnaissance pilot, so my job was to go out and scout and recon. Well, I did the same thing with churches. I would always go to a church by myself. I'd come back and tell Lindsay all about it, and the next week the family would go. So the next weekend, I went to St. Michael the Archangel Catholic Church in Leesville, Louisiana. I went to Mass there. A great church. To this day, still very good friends with some people in that parish. Went there, the priest was great, did a good job, the music was good, Mass was Mass, and it was great. And I went home and I said, yeah, it's a good church. I said, I think it'll be a good fit for us. A lot of, people our age, there's a lot of kids, faith formation's about to start and everything. She said, okay, let's go. So the next week, it was on my 35th birthday, Lindsay and I and our two oldest kids, we went to Catholic church, and we've been Catholic ever since. That fall, a few weeks later, we started RCIA, and our kids started faith formation. Both of our kids, our two oldest kids at the time, our youngest wasn't born yet, but our two oldest kids were baptized there. The same godparents that we're still very, very close friends with to this day. You know, they were there with us. They helped us along the whole way. And it was actually a lot of fun because the four of us were joining the church at the same time. So the way that they did church, they did everything there is we did RCIA on Sunday mornings, and at the same time, the kids did faith formation. So we do that, and on the way home, my son Gavin from the back seat, he'd say, "Hey Dad, did you know this about the Catholic Church?" And he would tell us something he learned. I was like, "No, I didn't know that. That's pretty neat." And then I'd say, "Hey, did you know this?" So the four of us were learning about the church together. And that Easter, this next Easter will be the 10-year anniversary, but that Easter we were all four brought into the Catholic Church and have been Catholic ever since. And we'll continue to do so. And when I tell this whole story, I don't see us getting into the Catholic Church as the end of the journey. It's just the start of a new one. Because I don't think the journey's over until we leave, until our time on earth is done. So we're continuing to learn about the Catholic Church. We're continuing to study. We're continuing to become the best Catholic Christians we can, as I think we all are. And, you know, we finished our time at Fort Rucker. I got off active duty, in Louisiana. I got off active duty and moved to Texas for about 5 years. Went to a parish there. And then 2 years ago, we moved back here to the great state of Minnesota, found New Prague, came here, and the very first thing we did was come to St. Wentz and, you know, started getting involved. And when I look back at this entire journey, I would have to say that the biggest impact on us being here and the biggest impact on us becoming Catholic, it wasn't a priest or a deacon or anybody that pulled us aside and said, "Hey, you know, you guys are going to the wrong church. Let me set you straight, let me get you the right church." And it wasn't a missionary that came knocking on the door with some literature, or it wasn't, you know, a big experience, a big, you know, vision or anything like that. When I say the biggest impact that on us in this entire journey was seeing faithful Catholics just being faithful Catholics. And that's where you all come in, myself included. Because when I see people like my grandparents growing up, they always went to Mass, never stopped, never failed, and no matter what we did, they always went to Mass. My aunt, when I lived in Hawaii, she always went to Mass. It was a priority for her. And all through my life, I've always seen how faithful they were to their Catholic faith. And one of the kind of a neat thing too is my job that I have now, I travel a lot. So I try to go to Mass. Whenever I'm not in town, I try to go to Mass if it fits into my schedule. So I get the privilege of going to Mass in a lot of different parishes all over the United States. And I had overnight, over a weekend, it worked out a couple months ago that I had an overnight in Honolulu. So I Ubered down the road to St. Peter and Paul's Catholic Church. And I was standing outside the church and I looked across the parking lot and I could see the apartment that my aunt used to live in. She's since passed away. And I saw the apartment and I thought, "Man, that's kind of cool." Started getting really nostalgic. And I went in there and I was sitting there before Mass and I thought, you know what, I wonder how many times my aunt prayed for me when I was sitting in her apartment. And she sat in the same church praying for me, and now I'm here. Part of the same holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, is one church, and I love that connectedness of this church. And when I say that, you know, faithful Catholics being faithful Catholics, so Father Norris, Father Tyson, great priests, but they're not standing out on the street corner during the day preaching to people, and they're not drawing people to the Catholic Church. We are. And when people see how you act on a Tuesday morning at work, when people know that you're a practicing Catholic, when people know that you go to St. Wentz, you're saying something for the Catholic Church, either good or it's bad. But a faithful Catholic just living their life as a faithful Catholic speaks much more for this church than anything else. It impacted us, and it continues to impact us. I pray every day that I can be like that. Sometimes I fall short, but you know, I do my best, and I think we all are. And some of the ways that we do that, participating in the sacraments, that's what gives us the fuel, and that's what gives us the spiritual nourishment we need to go out and reach others. Being involved in small groups. This parish does a great job with small groups. There's men's groups, there's women's groups, there's men's and women's groups. Great resource to further your faith and deepen your faith. And I would encourage you to do anything you can to continue that faith and continue to live that faithful Catholic Christian life, because you never know, in 10 years, there may be somebody standing up here sharing how they got to the Catholic Church because of something that you did, that they saw you do. So, by all means, again, I thank you for allowing me to share this with you. I hope you got something out of it. I will turn it over to whoever's next. Just kidding. Actually, but
Wasn't that wonderful? That is so good. If you want to book him for your parish or church, contact his agent, Lindsay. So, thank you again all for coming. We so appreciate Cory spending his time here with us tonight and sharing his story. And we appreciate you all coming very, very much. Keep watching for other events that are coming forth. We always have nights like this. And then also, like Cory alluded to, we want to start some men's ministry groups. We have women's, we want to start some more couples groups, and we want to start some more men's groups. So if that's something you're interested in, please contact the Faith Formation Office. Lynn, our director, is right here. We want to do what you want, so let us know how we can make that happen. Thank you very much. Have a safe ride home.